Tillman interview is a very important point. This is where Porfirio Diaz announces to the world that he will soon be leaving the presidency. He was probably not sincere about it, and in fact, when he ultimately decides not to step down, we see major riots outbreak across Mexico. Slide number 17 shows a print, Manifestación Antireeleccionista, anti-re-election riot made by the very famous Mexican printmaker Jose Guadalupe Posada Aguilar. He was the one that invented the famous Calaveras and the Catarina, but his first political cartoons demonstrated the power of the state putting down violently by force, killing protesters who were protesting that Porfirio Diaz, despite the fact that he said he was about to step down from power, in fact remained in power. Well, up north in Mexico, in the state of Coahuila, a man named Francisco Madero said that he was ready to challenge Porfirio Diaz. Now, when Porfirio Diaz called off the elections, Francisco Madero went into hiding. First, he went to the Mexican town of San Luis Potosí, and he declared a plan, the so-called Plan de San Luis Potosí, which called for an uprising across Mexico. Interestingly, he actually drafted in San Antonio, Texas. But he called for an uprising, I believe it was November 10th, 1910, where anyone who was opposed to Porfirio Diaz and his continuing presidency dictatorship over Mexico should take up arms and ride into rebellion. There were, of course, two regions in Mexico that were particularly ripe for rebellion. The north, Chihuahua, where all of these cowboys who had worked on the haciendas suddenly found themselves thrown out of work. They're willing to join these caudillos who are putting together revolutionary armies to ally with Madero to overthrow Porfirio Diaz. Most important amongst these northern generals who were organizing these discontented cowboys suddenly thrown out of work in the north were Venustiano Carranza, and we'll talk more about him, but also Pancho Villa. Francisco Doroteo Aranga, his real name, but of course he is known to history as Pancho Villa. Meanwhile, in the southern state of Morelos in Mexico, right outside of Mexico City, I should say, the farmers of Morelos had lost their land for generations to the sugar lords, who were expanding their territorial holdings at the expense of peasants. The vast majority of peasants in Morelos, Mexico, had owned their land in the 1850s. By 1900, almost all of them had lost their land to the expanding domains of the sugar barons, who were closely allied with Porfirio Diaz. Well, they wanted their land back, and they joined the Madero revolt as well. Now, when Madero, he calls for the revolt, he's going to call this revolt, everyone's supposed to rise up in arms against Porfirio Diaz in November of 1910. The day comes, and in the north, the resistance is kind of weak. Now, down in Morelos, Zapata rides into rebellion, but up north, in Coahuila, it's not all that revolutionary. But in neighboring Chihuahua, people are ready to fight. Pascual Orozco, who was a muleteer in Chihuahua, Doroteo Arango, who was a very pro-U.S. man, better known as Pancho Villa. These people rise up in support of Madero. They ride in to support Madero as he re-enters the country through El Paso, Texas. You can see on slide number 19 the location of El Paso. Just across the border is the Mexican town of Juarez. The first battle of the war is the Battle of Juarez, where Porfirio Diaz's troops fight against Madero and his deputies. Madero wins. Slide 20 shows some of the most important generals involved in this battle, but chief among them is Francisco Villa, Pancho Villa. They defeat Diaz. Diaz, who was not able to win this battle. And further, Taft, the president of the United States, put 20,000 U.S. troops along the border to make sure none of this violence was poured into the United States. even though in El Paso, Texas, plenty of Americans went up to the roof of the International Hotel and actually watched the battle taking place across the border in Juarez from the comfort of the hotel roof. Nevertheless, the Maderistas, the followers of Madero, won this battle. Diaz, who it turns out had been more expendable than the United States than he had thought, goes into exile. The United States stops sending weapons to Porfirio Diaz. Porfirio Diaz's loss at the Battle of Juarez shows that the revolution is going to achieve its aim, right? Because this only started as a political revolution. Because Porfirio Diaz would not give up power, Francisco Madero rose in revolt against Porfirio Diaz and defeated him at the Battle of Juarez. That was 1910. That could have been the end of it. If it was just a political revolution to get rid of the aging dictator and to put a democratically elected president into power, then it would have ended right there. However, is that once the fighting broke out, it turns out that all sorts of different people were fighting for all sorts of different reasons. Up north, cowboys who were out of work were fighting because they were getting paid to fight in the armies run by Villa or Carranza or Orozco. Down south in Morelos, the people following Emiliano Zapata, the charismatic leader of the Morelos rebellion, they wanted their land back. Madero had won the victory against Porfirio Diaz, but they insisted that Madero now return their lands to them. They mobilized. The peasants of Morelos made up these voluntary militias who rode into rebellion against Porfirio Diaz and ultimately would not put down their weapons for the next 10 years. They see when the rebellion broke out, these peasants in Morelos, they took up their guns, seized their lands, right? These great sugar barons who had taken their lands piecemeal over the past 50 years. Well, in 1910, when the rebels rose up in Morelos, they took their land back. And they were willing and ready to guard it with their lives and with their weapons, should anyone ever come and take it from them. For them, freedom meant owning land. Hence, the Zapatista rallying cry was Tierra y Libertad, which means in English, land and liberty. So up north, we have out-of-work cowboys. Under Madero, we have middle-class people who want access to political power and to end the re-election, and to end the dictatorship. And down in Morelos, we have people who want their land back. These are three very different reasons to overthrow Porfirio Diaz. As a result, the Mexican Revolution does not end in 1910 with the overthrow of Porfirio Diaz. Rather, it lasts another 10 years, as all of these different causes for the rebellion are ultimately sorted out. In any case, in 1911, Francisco Madero claims the presidency for himself and plans to have elections the following years. Most everybody lays down their arms except for Zapata. Zapata does not believe that the new president, Francisco Madero, is truly going to return their land for him, so they won't put their weapons down. And in fact, Emiliano Zapata issues one of the most famous documents in the history of 20th century Latin America, the so-called Plan de Ayala, or his plan to ensure that all the peasants of Morelos have both tierra y libertad. Right? What does that mean? He's going to get them their land and liberty back. When Madero just calls for elections and doesn't make any effort to return land to the peasants, Zapata, disappointed, remains in rebellion. He insists that the return of land, property, timber, water, everything which had been taken over by the oligarchic elite in Mexico be returned to the property of the villages and Mexican cities. Mexican citizens. They get all their land, their water, their timber back. This was ultimately the goal of the Plan de Ayala. You can see the text of that plan. And of course, since he was still in rebellion, Madero ultimately has to fight and try and put down that rebellion. The man that he sends to try and put down the rebellion is a man named Victoriano Huerta, a decorated military general who has despotic leanings himself, and he absolutely crushes Morelos. The great Mexican poet Marciano Silva wrote this poem about Morelos, being crushed by the not the dictator this time, but by the democratically elected president Madero, who sent out this military to repress the volunteer soldiers who had taken up arms in Morelos in defense of their lands against outsiders. Our pueblos only plains, white ashes, pictures of horror, sad deserts, isolated places, where only sorrow stirs. Ill-fated remains we venerate like relics of our love, where we were born, where we were raised, and happily we saw the sunlight. Nevermore, Morelos has become a terrible war zone, and the carnage of the military trying to repress this rebellion in Morelos only adds to the resolve of the Zapatistas. Finally, there's one other group of people who are also very important to the history of Mexico that are very upset with Madero, and of course that's the United States. The United States had wanted no stability. They had wanted stability. They had wanted no change. Madero was supposed to be friendly, but it turns out that Madero isn't going to totally serve U.S. interests the way that Porfirio Diaz had. As a result, the United States ambassador to Mexico, a man by the name of Henry Lane Wilson, started intriguing against Madero, turning his close deputies, even Huerta, who had led the strike force to put down the rebellion in Morelos. These people start to be organized against Madero. And tacitly, Henry Lane Wilson, the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, makes it possible for Victoriano Huerta, who had just fresh from Morelos, to march into Mexico and to crush Madero. Madero hid in the presidential palace. There were 10 days of terrible fighting in the streets of Mexico City, but ultimately Huerta was victorious. Madero was removed from power and was killed. Huerta, who was Madero's military man in charge, was supposed to protect Madero. Instead, he murdered him. What happens then? Terrible instability and counter-revolution as Huerta becomes a dictator, even more brutal than Porfirio Diaz had been before him. The U.S. ambassador Henry Lane Wilson had overseen and organized for the defeat of Madero. Huerta had murdered him, and now we see a return to dictatorship in Mexico. So we refer to the period 1913 to 1915 in the Mexican revolution as the counter-revolution, where we see a new dictator take control over Mexico. Now, what Huerta's going to do is to tremendously expand the Mexican army. The leva, or the draft, is instituted. The army goes around just taking people and forcing them into the Mexican army. The Mexican National Army was mostly made up of people pressed into service. 85% of the federal budget went to paying for the 85,000 soldiers that Huerta added to the army. By March of 1915, the army had reached 250,000 people, and now Huerta, who had been fighting the Zapatistas for years now, could use this fully ready to use this buff, powerful army to crush the rebels in Morelos. Now, he was never able to crush Zapata and his men entirely, but he drove the villagers into concentration camps. He scattered the Zapatistas into surrounding states. Using the full brunt of the Mexican government and the Mexican army, he was bringing the hammer down on Morelos. But he was making a lot of enemies in doing so. And immediately, a challenge emerged to his dictatorship. Now, the United States had helped this coup d'etat, which had removed Madero from power and brought Huerta in. But Huerta is not particularly popular with the United States because we talked about this before, but Woodrow Wilson, who becomes the president of the United States, he had an idea for Mexico, like he had an idea for Europe, that the whole world should become more democratic. Right? So when he saw one dictator removed from power and then a president removed and replaced with another dictator, Woodrow Wilson, who was an idealist, was of course disappointed. So he opposed the dictatorship of Huerta. But Huerta had internal enemies as well, particularly in the north, the constitutionalists. Even as he was attacking Morelos and driving Zapata to despair, Pancho Villa and Venustiano Carranza were busy organizing a new popular army, the so-called Constitutionalist Army. And the most important general in that army to emerge during this time period was Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa, during this time period, to fight the dictatorship of Huerta, put together the largest popular army ever seen in the history of Mexico. Now, some people referred to Pancho Villa as a bandit because he did have a checkered past. Little is known about Pancho Villa's childhood, where he came from. There's many stories about him having many wives in different states, about him killing an hacienda owner in order to protect the virtue of his sister who was being sexually assaulted by that hacienda owner. There were stories about him robbing Americans and giving the money to the Mexicans. All sorts of stories about him were emerging, and he had the reputation as something of a bandit. What Pancho Villa actually was, and what we know about him, is he was a middle-sized landowner who had a lot of mules and did pretty well for himself in the north of Mexico in the state of Chihuahua. He was one of these cowboys, but a very, very successful one. And, when you call him a bandit, well, yeah. Was he fighting the federal government? Absolutely. Was it a dictatorship? Yes. How big was his army? Well, 30,000 people at its height. Bandits don't really have organized armies of tens of thousands of people behind them. Pancho Villa was able to put this large army together by attacking the Terrazas clan. Remember, I mentioned the Terrazas before. The Terrazas were the largest land-owning family in the state of Chihuahua, where Pancho Villa was from. What they would do would be to attack these Terrazas lands, take them over, and then rent them out to people. The money that they made from renting that land out, Pancho Villa then used to pay his soldiers. So all these cowboys who were thrown out of work could now go join Pancho Villa's revolutionary army and fight and get paid for doing it. As a result, Pancho Villa's army grows tremendously. It's 30,000 people. In the north of Mexico, they controlled the railways, they controlled the territory, they controlled the villages. And his army was made up mostly of poor people, workers, former military colonists, cowboys, all of these people who were now being paid a weekly wage. They also received some Social Security. If you were in Pancho Villa's army and you were killed, the proceeds from renting out the land seized by Pancho Villa's army would then be used to pay a pension to widows. So, as a result, joining Pancho Villa's army was a pretty good place to find employment for all these northerners who didn't have work, but also, had guns and actually had a lot of experience using those guns in fighting the Native Americans who had been dispossessed of northern Mexico in the late 19th century. So these were violent people who were good on horseback and were ready to fight. And Pancho Villa is able to pay them with a wage because the Terrazas clan had so much land that Villa could take over and then rent out to other people.
Francisco Villa nació con el valor mexicano para ayudar a los pobres contra el yugo del tirano. Villa salió del parral